First of all, thank you all for coming. Before I begin my more formal remarks, I wanted to say a few comments about Professor Hyman. Actually, he always referred to me as Professor Dauber, even when I first started, and I always think of him. I can't think of him anything but Professor Hyman. That's sort of the image I have, not Arthur or anything else. He was very good to me. He hired me when he was the dean of the Revel Graduate School, and in many ways really helped advance my career. He was always encouraging of my work, happy to chat with me about whatever I was working on, and gently and even a little not so gently pushing me regarding my research as I was preparing for tenure. Now, as you may know, he was the student of the great scholar of Jewish philosophy, Harry Wolfson. And Professor Hyman wrote a remembrance of Harry Wolfson, but actually some of the comments he makes about Harry Wolfson really refer to him as well. So I just want to read to you one thing that he wrote about Harry Wolfson. He writes that Harry Wolfson was a high priest of learning who guarded its purity, kept it from vulgarization, and selected for himself a kind of integrity and discipline which were expected of the high priest of old. And I really think that does characterize Professor Hyman as well. He really was a high priest of Jewish philosophy, and he was certainly regarded as such by his colleagues. He was an advocate for and a defender of rigorous Jewish studies. And he's someone whose philosophic learning really imbued him with a deep general wisdom, such that his opinions and his advice always, at least for me, and I believe for many others, carried great weight. And he really is very sorely missed in Revel. Now, as you know, Professor Hyman dedicated himself to the study of Maimonides. And in his memory, I'm going to focus on some of the opposition between the very first Kabbalists and Maimonides. So I'll begin with some more general remarks, and then I want to talk about something more specific based on some more recent research that I've been working on. So let me begin with a little bit of a historical orientation. So as you may know, Maimonides died in 1204 in Egypt, and the first full-fledged Kabbalistic texts were written in the 1220s, the 1230s, in southern France and in Catalonia by a circle of Kabbalists who included Azra ben Shlomo of Girona, Azrael of Girona, Yaakov ben Sheshet, and a number of other key figures. So in short, the first Kabbalistic texts were written about 2 or 3 decades after the death of Maimonides. And the question I really want to begin with tonight is, why is it that prior to the 13th century, we have no Kabbalistic texts, no Kabbalistic writings? And then all of a sudden, in the 13th century, we begin to find Kabbalists producing, at a pretty fast rate, Kabbalistic works. Now, there are certainly earlier texts that are often thought of as Kabbalistic, such as Sefer Yetzirah or the Echalot corpus. But from a technical point of view, and the first Kabbalists would have readily conceded this, that the first texts, these earlier texts, are not really Kabbalistic. For example, even though Sefer Yetzirah mentions the Sfirot, it was a text that was commented on by various Jewish philosophers long before Kabbalists ever talked about it. And all this earlier material really lacks the understanding of the Sfirot as 10 manifestations of God that really came to define the nature of Kabbalah. And I won't tonight get into the debate about the question of when the Zohar was written, but even according to the traditional view that it's an ancient text, the Zohar wasn't known until considerably after the text that I'm talking about. So for all intents and purposes, these are really the first Kabbalistic texts. So the question remains, why now? And more specifically, where did it come from? Where did these Kabbalists get their information to suddenly start writing? And here's actually a case where more recent academic scholarship has actually aligned more and more with Kabbalists' own self-understanding. And in particular, recent scholarship has argued that Kabbalists, in fact, were the bearers of traditions that were passed down orally through the generations, only they first wrote them down in the 13th century. So really the question then is why did they first write down these traditions then, in the 13th century? And here is where we come to Maimonides. And I'll remind you that in the 1220s, in the 1230s, in the first half of the 13th century, in southern France and Catalonia, Maimonides' works, especially his philosophical ideas, had really penetrated and were really sort of the talk of the day. And various scholars have contended that Maimonides has something to do with this phenomena of the first Kabbalists beginning to write. Now, I mentioned Azra ben Shlomo of Girona earlier, one of the first Kabbalists. In fact, he's probably the first Kabbalistic author that we have. His commentary on the Song of Songs, as far as we can tell, was the first Kabbalistic text. And in the introduction to his commentary, he actually provides an explanation as to why he wrote down this first Kabbalistic text. He begins with a whole chain of transmission of Kabbalah. He starts even before Sinai. It started with Noah, passed down through the generations, eventually was forgotten in Egypt, and given again at Sinai. And he's very keen to stress in his introduction that from Sinai till his own day, Kabbalah was never forgotten. And if you look at the source sheets that hopefully you have by now, you'll see that's text number 1. I think I'm going to read in English just to save a little bit of time. He says, from that period until now, there never ceased to be a generation to which the heritage of wisdom, that is knowledge of the divine name, was transmitted through the tradition of oral Torah. And remember this point, his stress that Kabbalah was never forgotten. Eventually, though, he says that while it was never forgotten, it was virtually forgotten. He, of course, still possessed it, but the majority of people in his day, he believed, no longer did. Not only that, in his day, not only was Kabbalah virtually forgotten, there also was a new phenomenon that was, from his point of view, threatening Judaism. And that's now text number 2. That appears a little bit further in his introduction. He says, again, I'll read the English, interpreters arose, possessing neither wisdom nor insight, whether they turned toward the right or toward the left. They turned the words of holiness into profanity, diminishing scripture, adding, detracting, enhancing, interpreting passages spoken through the Holy Spirit from a quarry of sacred gems in terms never to be entertained by the human intellect, let alone spoken, how much more so transcribed in a book. I call such interpreters those who have returned. Can you hear me? Good? Yeah? I call such interpreters those who have returned the words of the living God, the Lord of hosts. Concerning this dual cessation and nullification of Kabbalistic wisdom in Israel, the prophet, trembling, devastated, and sighing, said, many are the days which will pass in Israel without the God of truth and without Torah. By the phrase, without the God of truth, he referred to the interruption of knowledge of God, may he be blessed in Israel. Hafsek idiyat Hashem itbarach mi-Yisrael. So who are these interpreters who are a threat to Judaism? So following the lead of other scholars, I've argued in some of my previous work that these followers are in fact these interpreters are in fact followers of Maimonides. Now remember, the commentary on the Song of Songs was probably composed right around the time of the Maimonidean controversy, which reached a head in the early 1230s and very much divided the entire Jewish community in southern France and in Catalonia, really in the very spot where the first Kabbalists were active, ultimately culminating in the burning of Maimonides' books. And the claims that Maimonides makes in this passage, and as well as in the remainder of the passage that I didn't cite, are claims that are quite familiar to those who know the literature from the controversy. So for example, one of the accusations against Maimonideans and against Maimonides in the literature of the controversy is that they allegorized the Torah. And this seems to be Ezra's critique here as well, when he says, "Hafchu divrei kodesh l'derech chol," that they turned words of holiness into profanity. He seems to be implying that these interpreters have misinterpreted the Torah by allegorizing it. Now, Ezra's comments should be seen against the backdrop of a broader argument by Moshe Idel, who is a prominent scholar of Kabbalah. Idel argues, or Idel notes, I should say, that an important impetus for Kabbalists to start writing down their traditions, were Maimonides' claims about Maaseh Bereshit, the account of creation, and Maaseh Merkava, the account of the chariot. So as you may know, these are terms that appear in the Mishnah and Masechet Chagiga. And in their original context, Maaseh Bereshit seems to refer to some sort of esoteric interpretation of the creation narrative, whereas Maaseh Merkava seems to refer to some sort of, again, esoteric interpretation of Ezekiel's chariot vision in Yecheskel Perek Aleph. Now, the rabbis in this Mishnah place very strict regulations about disseminating this material. They argue that it has to be kept private, it has to be kept secret. And the fact of the matter is that they largely followed their own strictures. And the bottom line is we're not quite sure what the rabbis actually meant, what the true contents of Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava really are. And certainly in the Middle Ages, this sort of left things wide open for people to make various claims about what the true contents of Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava really were. And what Maimonides argues is that Maaseh Bereshit is equivalent to Aristotle's physics, and Maaseh Merkava is equivalent to Aristotle's metaphysics. And he claims, moreover, that the Torah and rabbinic literature leave hints about physics, about metaphysics, and that the way to understand these hints, the way to figure out what these hints mean, is to read the literature in light of Aristotle. In other words, in Maimonides' view, Aristotle is the tool that allows us to know what the rabbis really meant by these deep esoteric traditions of Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava. In the third chelik of the guide, the third section of the Guide of the Perplexed, right before he presents a commentary, his own commentary, on Ezekiel's chariot vision, he actually prefaces it by saying that the account of the chariot, the true content of the account of the chariot, has been totally forgotten. That the rabbis were so successful in preventing its dissemination that nobody knows it anymore. And the only way that he, Maimonides, was able to uncover it was by turning to Aristotle and trying to search for hints in the Bible and hints in the rabbis and reading them in light of Aristotle. And you have to pause for a minute and consider how audacious of a claim this really is. What Maimonides is effectively doing is presenting Aristotle as the key to understanding the deepest stratum of Jewish thought. And Moshe Idel argues that Maimonides' understanding of Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava was seen by the first Kabbalists as a usurpation of the true Maaseh Bereshit, the true Maaseh Merkava. In fact, they believed, and Azra makes this quite clear, that the true Maaseh Bereshit and the true Maaseh Merkava are the contents of their own traditions of Kabbalah. And these Kabbalists wanted to set the record straight. And to do so, they had to start writing. They had to show we have the real traditions. We know what the real Maaseh Bereshit and the real Maaseh Merkava is in the face of Maimonides' claims. Now, Idel focuses on the first few hundred years of Kabbalah. Interestingly, he doesn't mention the particular passage we just read, but as I noted, this was probably the first Kabbalistic text intended for public consumption. And in fact, I think it broadly confirms Idel's argument. First, recall again Ezra's claim that Kabbalah was never forgotten. And that really seems to be an answer to Maimonides. Maimonides says it was forgotten and he has to rediscover it through Aristotle, but on the contrary, it's never been forgotten at all. Moreover, when Ezra claims that the followers of Maimonides, these interpreters, led to Hefsek Yidiyat Hashem, the interruption of knowledge of God, what he seems to be saying is that philosophic Aristotelian metaphysics were becoming entrenched in the Jewish community as though they were the true knowledge of God. When in fact, Ezra believes that the true knowledge of God is Kabbalah. In the continuation of his remarks, Ezra notes he's getting older, doesn't have much time left to write, and in the face of these Maimonideans, he makes clear, and this is very much in line with Idel's theory, that he needs to write down his Kabbalistic traditions as a way of setting the record straight. Now, if you think about it, the emergence of Kabbalah as a literary tradition is really a crucial moment in the history of Jewish thought. It allowed Kabbalah to become studied, to thrive, ultimately to find the very central place that it still has up until this day in Jewish thought. And as scholars have pointed out, there's really some irony here, that Maimonides, who surely would not have liked Kabbalah had he been aware of it, unwittingly was the cause for its ultimate success. So that's the first part of my lecture. The second part of my lecture deals with an implied polemic against Maimonides that appears elsewhere in Ezra's writing. And as I say, this is based on a recent study that I completed. And it's actually a nice example of interesting things you can find when you read manuscripts, as opposed to simply relying on published works. Because the polemic that I'm talking about actually appears only in manuscript. Now, a couple of words of preface. To understand this passage, you have to know about the Sabians. The Sabians are a nation that Maimonides talks about extensively in the Guide of the Perplexed. They're also mentioned in Islamic literature in various places. And there's a running debate among contemporary scholars who these Sabians really were. But for our purposes, what really matters is who Maimonides thought the Sabians were. And Maimonides understood the Sabians as Sabianism, I should say, as the faith of the ancient Near East at the time of the Bible. And in the various accounts of Sabian faith and practices that he had in his possession, he thought he had the key to understanding what it is that the Torah had to contend with. And he concluded that Sabianism was idolatry, and therefore the Torah was dedicated to destroying any traces of Sabianism. And in fact, his account of Sabianism has a major role in his account of the explanation of the commandments. Various commandments are directed, according to Maimonides, to combat the practices of the Sabians. And I want to really stress how unsparing he is in his critique of Sabianism. For him, Sabianism is really the antithesis of the Torah. And I'll come back to Sabianism in a minute. Now, in addition to his commentary on the Talmudic Aggadot, Ezra also wrote a commentary, in addition to his commentary on the Song of Songs, Ezra also wrote a commentary on the Talmudic Aggadot, which has only been partially published. And the passage we're going to look at remains in manuscript. It appears in full in one manuscript, Vatican number 441, and in part in a second Vatican manuscript with a shelf number of 296. Very short passage. This is text number 3 on your pages. The Hebrew is my transcription. The material in the parentheses are the variants from the second manuscript. So I'll read it again in English. The philosophers did not know how to name the 6 extremities, and they called them the sphere. And they said that the Creator is the soul of the sphere and its spirit. Their saying is according to the correct tradition, but those who apprehended under the influence of the philosophers, or according to the path of philosophy, did not know how to study the 6 extremities, and they called them the sphere. And then the other manuscript adds, understand this, for it is a great principle. They the philosophers, said further that Adam came from male and female. And they said that all the boundaries of the earth have a star that rules over them, who is their God. Now, this is a very technical passage. I'm not going to trouble you with the technicalities. But what I want to really highlight here is that what Ezra is claiming is that views of the philosophers and views of the Kabbalists are one and the same thing. Only difference is that they have some different nomenclature. So for example, what Kabbalists call the 6 extremities, that's a reference to 6 of the lower sphirot, philosophers refer to as the sphere. Philosophers have this notion that Adam was born of male and female. Kabbalists have some sort of parallel notion, and so on. And I should say, this is not an intrinsically surprising comment. Other members of Ezra's circle also have similar comments about philosophers. They say the same things that we do, only their nomenclature is different. What is surprising about this passage, though, is when you begin to look and figure out who these philosophers are. Who are these philosophers? And it turns out that these philosophers are in fact Sabians. And the truth is, Ezra knew nothing about Sabianism independently. His only knowledge of Sabianism comes from Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. And really what he's doing is he's taking views of the Sabians, calling them views of the philosophers, and saying that these views of the Sabians and these views of the philosophers are one and the same thing. And if you look in this chart number 4 over here, you can see how I charted this out for you. I used Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed and Yehuda al-Kharizi's translation, which was the translation preferred by the first Kabbalists over the more common translation by Shmuel ibn Tibbon. And I won't take you through all the examples, but just for example, consider the second box, right? In the guide, Maimonides writes, Vayu omrim ki adam harishon nolad mizachar u'nekeva. And they, he means the Sabians he's talking about here, would say that Adam was born of male and female. Similarly, Azra says, Vamru od ha-filosofim ki adam harishon haya mizachar u'nekeva. They, the philosophers, said further that Adam came from a male and female. And you can follow through. You'll see that all the views of the Sabians, all the views of the philosophers are really the views of the Sabians. Now, Ezra doesn't explain how they're equivalent to Kabbalah, and in the longer version of the story, of this essay, I should say, I have some theories. But what I want to focus on now is the polemical content of these remarks. Because really what Ezra is doing here is taking ideas denigrated by Maimonides and arguing that they're equivalent to Kabbalah, equivalent to the deepest stratum of Judaism. Now, in the guide itself, Maimonides, again in al-Kharizi's translation, says of the Sabians that they were rechokim me'od min ha-philosophia v'chi hayu b'tachlit ha-sichlut, right? They were very distant from philosophy, and they were of the utmost foolishness. Ezra, though, refers to them as philosophers. And what I think you have here is an ironic and polemical usage. In his view, the real philosophers are precisely those whom Maimonides denigrates as far from philosophy. Elsewhere in the commentary on the Talmudic Agadot, there's an extended passage where Ezra critiques the masses. He calls them the Hamon, for the way they interpret the Torah. I didn't cite it for you. His critique, again, is that they read the Torah allegorically. Very similar, even uses some of the same language as his critique of the Maimonidean interpreters that we saw earlier. And there, too, another example where he's using the term masses ironically. The masses who he denigrates are really the philosophers, are really the followers of Maimonides. Now, in the guide, Maimonides says that the beliefs of the Sabians are in keeping with some of the beliefs of the masses of his own day. So if you take the passage regarding the masses and the passage regarding the Sabians together, what Ezra is effectively saying is that what you Maimonides refer to as the views of the masses are really the views of the philosophers, and what you take as the philosophical approach to Torah is really the approach of the masses. And all in all, a very thoroughgoing polemic. So to briefly sum up, we saw that Ezra opposed Maimonides' attempt to bring Aristotle into the heart of Judaism. But he actually goes even further. Not only did he reject what Maimonides wanted to bring into Judaism, he accepted into the heart of Judaism ideas that Maimonides despised. Thank you.